recording this session. And also, if you look at your top left-hand corner, there is Otter Live Notes. So that provides kind of machine-generated transcript for accessibility needs. If you want to if you didn't think you heard something, you can always go back and see what it says on the transcripts. So it's an accessibility tool that we would love, we hope is helpful for you. And so if you're just joining us, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat and just tell us how you're affiliated with Peabody. Also, please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions, though a lot of people actually submitted some great questions, Lisa in the RSVP. So we already have a set of questions for you. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Fazio, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Vanderbilt University. She's a cognitive psychologist who studies how people learn new information, both true and false, and how to correct errors in people's knowledge. This focus includes how to mitigate the effects of reading false information and how to increase classroom learning. Her research informs basic theories about learning and memory, excuse me, while also having clear applications for practitioners such as journalists and teachers. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lisa Fazio.
Hey, well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm excited to chat with you, tell you about some of my research, and then also kind of answer questions and have a more free-form discussion. So my plan is to jump us off with kind of a 15-20 minute presentation on some of my work and some of the research we're doing in my lab here at Peabody, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So I'm gonna share. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about today is kind of why misinformation is a problem and something that we should be concerned about. So we're all smart people, so why can't we just realize that something's false and then not believe it? And I'm going to shoo my dogs out of the room because they decided now is a good time to play. So I will be right back. Okay, I'm back. Here we go. So we're going to start with a quick quiz. So I'm going to try and make this interactive. This doesn't always work well over Zoom, but we're going to try it anyway. So I want everyone to unmute themselves. And I'm going to ask a question, and I want you to just yell out the answer. So in the biblical story, what was Jonah swallowed by?
Whale.
No.
I heard whale, I heard large fish. Both are correct depending on kind of your translation of the Bible. Next one. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark?
2.
None.
All right, I heard a lot of 2s, but a couple of you caught it, and I heard you say none. So the question I asked was, how many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? And most of you know that it's actually Noah who took the animals on the ark. So that knowledge was in your head. You knew that it's Noah and the ark, but you still answered 2. And so this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. This failure to use our relevant knowledge and failure to notice errors in what we read and kind of the effects that has on us. So we call this the Moses illusion for kind of obvious reasons. In the original study, about 80% of participants failed to notice the error in this question and instead answered with 2. Even though they'd been warned ahead of time that some of the questions might be incorrect, and were even given an example of the type of question. If you give a kind of more strict warning, still about half of the participants will miss the error in this question. And follow-up studies have shown that it's not because people don't hear Moses, it's just because they don't realize it's incorrect in the moment. And if Moses is close enough to Noah that your brain doesn't realize there's been an error there. And so we call this knowledge neglect. And it's basically a failure to use relevant knowledge that you have about the world. And it's obviously really important in today's world where politicians, outside forces, malactors are all kind of spreading misinformation and false information. So I'm going to give a brief overview of kind of 3 examples of this knowledge neglect that we've studied in the lab, and some factors that do or don't help people notice errors in what they're reading. So the first example of that error is, of course, the Moses illusion. The second is what happens when people encounter errors in what they read. And so what we do in the lab is have people read fictional stories that contain true and false information about the world. So in a story about a summer job at the planetarium, you might read, "Lucky me, I had to wear some huge old spacesuit. I don't know if I was supposed to be anyone in particular. Maybe I was supposed to be Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon." And so some participants will read the correct information. So they'll read, maybe I was supposed to be Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. Other participants will read misleading information. So they'll read about John Glenn, the first man on the moon. And then other times they'll get this kind of neutral information where the story mentions the first man on the moon, but doesn't say who it was. General format of these experiments. First, we give people a warning. So we tell them that these stories are fictional and that authors of fiction often take liberties with certain facts or ideas in order to make the story flow better or be more entertaining. Therefore, some of the information you read may be incorrect. So we kind of tell them it's fiction, warn them some of it might be wrong. They read the stories that contain kind of 18 facts, so some correct, some misleading, some neutral. They do a short filler task, and then they take a general knowledge test that contains a bunch of questions, some of which refer back to the information from the story. And on that test, we tell participants not to guess, to just say, I don't know, if they're not sure about an answer, but to answer the questions that they do know. And so the key question is kind of what happens for these critical questions that refer to the information from the story. So first we're going to look at correct responses. So this is what proportion of people give the correct information. So here saying Neil Armstrong. And what you can see is that reading the correct information boosts your memory. So people are much more likely to produce the correct information when they've read it versus when they just get that neutral version. So kind of being reminded of that correct information helps you retrieve it later. But perhaps more interestingly, reading the wrong information actually decreases your memory. So you're less likely to come up with the correct answer when you've just read the wrong information in the story. Not only are you less likely to produce the correct information, you're also much more likely to produce that incorrect information. So here, almost 40% of the time, participants who read the false information in the story are using that later on this general knowledge test. So for that study, we had a variety of different types of facts. Some were ones that most college students should know the correct answer. Others were more obscure. And so we have a general sense of what should be known or not known, but we didn't know for any given person, did they definitely know the correct information before they read the story. So what we did in the follow-up was actually test people's knowledge before the experiment. So we gave them an online survey at least 2 weeks before the study, where they answered a bunch of trivia questions, some of which referred to the facts that they later see in the story, and then had kind of the typical experiment. And so what that allows us to do is only look at the questions that participants were able to answer correctly on this initial test. So among participants who knew that Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon, what's the effect of them reading about John Glenn? And so what you can see here is that even if they knew the answer 2 weeks earlier, about 20% of the time, people are switching and instead going with what they just read in the story. So they should have the knowledge in their head to realize this is an error and to avoid it. And instead, about 1/5 of the time, they're picking that up and using it on the later test. In fact, some of the time they're using it on the later test, even if they gave that initial correct answer with really high confidence. So if you look at just high confidence correct answers, you still see this effect of misinformation. It's smaller, but it's still there. So lots of evidence that participants often go with what they've just read in the story rather than what we know is in their memory. So I've got one more example of knowledge neglect. This one, I want you to imagine that kind of a friend tells you an interesting fact, and you have to decide if it's true or false. And you can think about there being 2 ways that you might judge truth. First would be to kind of search through your general knowledge, look for information that confirms or disproves the statement. But then there's also a much shorter way that humans use all the time, which is that we judge truth partially on how easy the sentence is to process. And one of the things that affects that ease is repetition. So statements that we've heard more than once, we tend to think are true. And in general, this makes sense. In the world, things that you hear often are likely to be true, and things that you only hear once are more likely to be false. But that can also be a really faulty cue when we're dealing with other things. So we call this the illusory truth effect. Illusory in that you it's gaining truth for no good reason. Typical experiment, you're shown a series of facts like these. So the first one is a false fact that should contradict most people's prior knowledge. So the Minotaur is the legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology. Most of the participants in our studies know that it's actually the Cyclops who's the one-eyed giant. And then the second example is one that's more unknown. So Angel Falls is located in Brazil, is false, but most participants don't know where it actually is located. So what happens is we have this exposure phase where you see some of the statements, and we ask you to just rate how interesting each statement is to you. Then there's the truth phase, where this time you're rating how true or false the statement appears to you. So we typically use a rating scale of 1 equals definitely false to 6 equals definitely true. And then finally in this study, we added a knowledge check at the end so we could see what participants actually knew. So here we ask them questions like, what's the name of the legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology? Is it Cyclops, Minotaur, or I don't know? So what that allows us to do is again, look only at the facts that we know people do have the correct knowledge for. So what I'm going to show here are just false statements. I'm going to split them by unknown. So these are statements that they either answered incorrectly or with I don't know on the knowledge check, versus known statements, which are the ones that they answered correctly. And so you replicate the typical effect for unknown statements, but you also find it for known statements. So even for this information that contradicts people's prior knowledge, when they hear it twice, they're more likely to think that it's true. Other researchers have looked at this effect using more naturalistic stimuli. So in this one study, they looked at fake political headlines, some of which appealed to Democrats, others that appealed to Republicans. What they found was this typical illusory truth effect where repetition increased belief. But one thing that I find really interesting is that it didn't matter if the headline was something people wanted to believe or not. So whether it matched their worldview or didn't affected how true they thought it was, but both groups showed this increase in repetition. Repetition increases belief for kind of fake news headlines that I really want to believe, but also for fake news headlines that I don't have any kind of motivation to believe. So why does this knowledge neglect happen? Why do people rely on what they read versus what they previously knew? I think there's two things going on. The first is a failure to detect the error. So like with the Moses illusion questions, people often just don't notice the error as they're reading or listening. And then the second thing is just accessibility. So when we're answering questions, we tend to go with the answer that comes to mind most quickly, rather than the answer that kind of has the most support or is most inscribed in our memory. So reading the errors in the story increases the accessibility of those wrong answers. And on the general knowledge quiz, you're going with that answer that comes to mind quickly. So there's a lot of evidence that people don't check everything they read to see if it's correct. Rather, they just check if it's good enough. And so back with that fictional paradigm, we did a study where participants had to, after each sentence, indicate whether or not there was an error in that sentence, or there was no error and they just wanted to move on to the next sentence. And what we found was that participants detected only about 23% of the errors. They should have been able to answer 65% of these questions correctly, and that's them producing the correct answer versus just recognizing it. And so they've got plenty of knowledge to detect a lot more of the errors than they are. In terms of kind of why information gets retrieved and used, the big thing is its accessibility, like I said. The two things that really affect that are time. So how long has it been since you've seen that information? And then repetition. So how many times have you heard that in the past? And so what's really important here is that when you're trying to answer questions or trying to retrieve information from your knowledge base, what really matters is how accessible the answer is, not its truth. So if you've been exposed to wrong information really recently or a lot of times, it's likely that that's what will come to mind rather than the correct information that you may have had stored initially. So the last thing I want to talk about is how we can get people to stop and actually use their prior knowledge in different situations. So I'm going to give you a sample of some of what we've tried and what does or doesn't work. So one thing you might try is to give people additional cognitive resources. So increase the likelihood of them detecting the error by making it less difficult to read the story. So in one experiment, we changed the reading level of the story. So some stories were easier to read and were written at a 6th grade reading level, whereas others are more difficult and were written at a 12th grade reading level. And so you might expect people would be better at detecting the errors in the easier to read story. Instead, performance was pretty similar across the groups. If anything, they might have learned a little more misinformation from the easier to read stories. Another possibility is to give them more time. So we presented the stories on a book on tape format and either kind of sped it up or slowed it down. Again, hypothesizing that slowing it down would allow readers to catch more of the misinformation and not use it later. Instead, slowing it down helped them learn the misinformation, and they were actually more likely to produce it on the final test. So kind of people don't naturally do this detection. If you give them more time, allow them to more carefully process it, they tend to just remember it better. Another thing you might try is to give people additional knowledge. So we've shown that that doesn't completely eliminate the effect, because I told you about kind of in both the fiction and illusory truth, how sometimes people will learn the misinformation even if they've got relevant prior knowledge. But there are limits. So if I ask you how many animals of each kind did Nixon take on the Ark, suddenly no one answers the question. So when the misinformation is blatant enough, people will notice the error and avoid it. Similarly, in the fiction paradigm, if we tell people that the Pilgrims sailed on the Titanic, or that Pluto is the largest planet, those errors people are able to kind of realize and avoid, and they don't use them on a later test. The only thing we've found that really helps with this issue is forcing people to do additional processing of the information. So that detection activity that I mentioned earlier, where people aren't very good at detecting the errors, that actually does help reduce the effect of misinformation. So it's, in fact, the only manipulation we found to decrease learning of these false facts in stories. When people are actively trying to detect the errors, they are able to avoid some of them. A different way of causing additional processing can be to ask people how they know that a statement is true or false. So we looked at that within the illusory truth studies, where we look at the effects of repetition. So this is just the control condition where both unknown and known falsehoods increase in their truth rating after repetition. But when we had people do this explanation task, so before each statement, they had to explain how they knew the statement was true or false, that reduced the effects of repetition. So overall, we find that providing people with additional cognitive resources, but not really giving them a task to do it, doesn't help. So both when we made the stories easier to read or slowed down their presentation, that didn't help and sometimes backfired. Additional knowledge can be useful. So it does help you detect really blatant errors, but it's not useful for these more semantically similar errors that you still miss more often than you should. But additional processing does seem to be effective, both when this active detection task and when we explicitly ask people to explain why a statement is true or false. So in conclusion, we find that detecting contradictions with stored knowledge can be really difficult. If they're undetected, the falsehoods are often used in later situations, like answering the general knowledge questions. When determining truth or answering questions, people don't rely on what's actually stored in their head. Instead, they rely on what comes to mind quickly and these kind of shortcuts like fluency. But pausing to think more deeply can help to prevent this knowledge neglect. So thank you. Look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Lisa. And everyone, please do feel free to add questions in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to have you ask your questions out loud as well. I think a lot of people are really interested, especially kind of in the time we're finding ourselves in how this application is related to politics and fake news. in politics. And I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things we've seen recently is misinformation isn't new. And kind of rumors being spread by politicians and by other people is also not new. What is new is how quickly and how far misinformation can spread now. So with the internet and with social media, these falsehoods are reaching more people and they're reaching them quicker, sometimes before we can kind of debunk what's going on. So I do think that we're in a kind of particularly vulnerable time right now because of just the speed that that misinformation can be spread. Sure. And it also doesn't help that social media is actively designed to be engaging and processed in a quick manner. Like, it has been specifically engineered to encourage you to scroll fast and scroll far and not to do this deep processing of what you're reading. So it's an area where you're particularly likely to not notice the errors that you're reading.
Thank you. I see, Nina, you had a question?
Thank you, sorry. Lisa, this is Nina. Thank you so much. Your research is fascinating and it's also a little terrifying. It's kind of a follow-up to Hasina, and I'm hoping you're going to tell me the answer I want to hear, but is there any research, or have you done any research about whether truth is judged according to who the speaker is or where it's read? So like,
yeah,
you know, Facebook versus a book, or, oh, I don't know, a random person in the White House versus another person?
Yeah, so these source effects are really interesting. There's some evidence that we don't pay as much attention to source as kind of we would hope. Source is often one of the first things we forget. So often a few weeks later, you remember a statement, but forget whether you read it kind of in the National Enquirer or in the New York Times. And so it can have a continued influence on your belief. But there is some evidence that kind of when we're distrustful and go into a situation with that distrust, we're less likely to be fooled. So it could be that kind of when you're listening to particular people, you have kind of a different mindset to that conversation than you would if you were listening to a friend.
Of course, that could go both ways, I guess, right? Because you might want to distrust the source, but it might also not make you open to something that you should be open to. So that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And another issue about social media is that the source is often a little hidden, in that it'll be posted by a friend or someone that you might trust, but the actual source is kind of many people back or hidden in there in a link.
Yeah, a person is kind of like the Wikipedia, sort of, but not quite. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Thank you. This was so fascinating. I'm an HDC counseling student, and I was wondering how this applies to doing things like steps to countering stigma. That's a major interest of mine. I want to work with the military, and so I've got work cut out for me on the countering that. I mean, just the stigma around mental health. So what are the steps involved in that? Thank you.
Yeah. Definitely a challenge and definitely something that we need people working on. So I'm glad you are. One of the things to keep in mind is basically you're going up against everything else that people experience in the day. And so in some ways, your intervention has to be more powerful than all of the kind of incidental exposure that people are getting from the media, from entertainment, things like that. For specific things that you're trying to debunk, our kind of current best framework for doing that is what's broadly called a truth sandwich. And so the idea is that you start with the fact. one possible fact could be something like global warming is caused by human interference or something like that. Then you mention the fallacy. So you mention what other people have been saying this wrong. Some people have argued that this is just natural fluctuations. All right, so fact, myth, then why it's wrong. So the fallacy, that's incorrect because blah, 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 blah. And then you go back to the fact. In fact, we have lots of evidence that blah, blah, blah. And so you're kind of starting with the true information, bringing up the falsehood, saying why it's wrong, and then following up with the truth. And the idea is that that will make the truth more memorable than the lie. And the really important thing there is kind of why the falsehood is false. So it's hard for people to remember just kind of fact false, because it's easy for that false tag to get forgotten. But if you tell them why it's false and give them kind of a causal explanation, that'll make it easier to remember. Even better if you can tie in kind of why people are trying to manipulate them or why this counter argument is out there or things like that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I think a couple of our questions were, I think Teresa mentioned the application in counseling, but I think a lot of people were also interested in applications in the classroom and how this work can prevent misinformation from happening within classrooms.
Yeah, so one of the things that prompted us to start doing some of this research was the use of kind of fictional sources in classroom settings.
Mm-hmm.
So teachers will often either show a video or have students read a novel because it is a more engaging way of dealing with the material. But because those sources are fictional, they often do contain errors. And so what some research has shown is that what you want to avoid is not talking about it. So either before or after people have read the work or viewed the video, you want to talk through what's wrong, why it's wrong, what the correct information is. Because there's evidence that there's a neat study that was done looking at kind of harmful myths from the movie The Help,
Mm-hmm.
and how the idea of kind of the benevolent servant and things like that get propagated. And so what you want to avoid is people watching the movie, taking their own conclusions and walking away. Instead, you want to make sure you've got a conversation about what was true, what wasn't, how we know, things like that.
It's really helpful. I can continue with questions, but I do want to make sure that people have a chance to ask the questions that they have. So do please feel free to jump in. I wonder, I think another question that we had from the RSVPs is, do you have any connection between what people believe or think is true and their behavior? And is there a link there?
Yeah, so that's always hard to tell,
Right.
because our behaviors are kind of complicated and affected by lots of things. So one thing I will say is there's a lot of speculation of how misinformation can affect voting or other behaviors, and very little hard evidence. Our votes are determined by so many things that any one thing is unlikely to have a big effect. There is some stronger evidence for the harms of misinformation around health, where you do see health misinformation causing kind of changes in behavior that you'd want to avoid, whether it's vaccine hesitancy or kind of hoax cures or various things like that.
That really nicely plays into this next question is how do you think this kind of fake news in our political sphere is affecting people's, maybe not of voting, but just of politics in general?
Yeah, so one of the things I worry about is that there's some evidence that one of the goals of Russia and some of the other foreign governments who are pumping misinformation is to get Americans to move to a point where they just distrust everything, where there are no trusted sources. And you can't have a democracy in that situation. So it's really a way of undermining America, undermining the government, to try and put so much false information out there that people kind of throw up their hands and say, just everything's false, I don't care, and just go hole up in a bunker. And so I think we need to be careful to be distrustful of things that are kind of borderline, but also to trust real sources. So there are really good journalists in this country who do excellent investigative journalism, who are really careful about what they write, how they source it, the process for getting that information. And I think if we lose faith in those institutions, then we're in big trouble. And it's one reason why I've been so disappointed with the politicalization of the CDC, where this was one of our trusted government sources that kind of everyone could agree. We take what they say because they are the experts. And by twisting that, it's really harmed kind of the future of the country, I think.
Did anybody else have a question? I did want to kind of, you mentioned journalists, and I'd love to hear a little bit more, because you mentioned having clear applications for journalists as well, and I would love to kind of hear what those would be.
Yeah, so one thing we've worked on is what's the best way to present fact checks to the public, so that they kind of remember the correct information and don't walk away thinking that the myth is the truth. For a few years, there was a lot of work suggesting that sometimes if you try and correct a myth, you'll actually increase belief in it. So it was called the backfire effect. And the idea was that kind of if I push against something that you strongly believe, you'll actually come back and believe it even more. Luckily, there's been a lot of research in the past 5 years showing that that actually doesn't happen. If it does happen, it happens to a small proportion of people on a very small number of issues. In general, fact-checking, debunking works. It does decrease people's belief in these myths. And so a lot of people were kind of holding back from debunking information because they didn't want to increase belief, and that's not the correct interpretation to take away from the research. Even the people who originally published the first backfire study have now come out to say, you know what, we think it might happen occasionally, but it doesn't happen often.
Yeah. And I think you had mentioned both like people reading and listening to stories, and is there a difference or with video? Because I think we have mediums of getting information.
We've seen the effects with all three.
Okay.
There haven't been careful considerations of whether one's more or less potent. I have a suspicion that when you hear it, it's less easy to detect the error than when you read it, given some studies we've done, but we've never explicitly tested that. One of the worries with video is kind of that it's more visually engaging, and so you'll remember it more. And so there's some suggestion that maybe videos might be particularly potent, but not that's been well tested.
Nina, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have another question. Yeah, thanks. Lisa, any effects of age or gender or demographics or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The effect of repetition on belief, there's very few individual differences that matter. So one thing people have been interested in is kind of if you're someone who is more reflective in your thinking, versus someone who just kind of goes with your gut? Would you be more likely to fall for these effects of repetition? That doesn't seem to matter. There's some evidence that age can actually protect people from some of these knowledge-based effects. So the disappointing cognitive curve of aging is basically things increase, they peak in your 20s or 30s, and then everything decreases. At different rates, everything decreases. The one thing that doesn't decrease is your general knowledge. So older adults have larger vocabs than college students. They kind of know more information than college students. And so there's at least one study suggesting that for these facts that contradict their prior knowledge, older adults are less likely to have that increase with repetition. But there's also a lot of evidence that older adults in general are not as good at detecting true and false political headlines. They're the ones who are exposed to the most false information on social media, and they're the ones who share the most false information on social media. And it's unclear right now if that's because of differences in digital literacy, differences in cognitive ability, or most likely differences in how they use social media. So younger adults tend to have lots of friends and people that they follow. Older adults tend to have fewer friends and instead follow more pages and groups. And there's lots of pages and groups that share a lot of misinformation.
Every time you make me feel better, you scare me again.
Hey now.
What about a match or mismatch between the demographics of the speaker, if known?
Ooh, I don't know of anything that's looked at that. In general, we find that people are more discerning when they're listening to someone who's kind of similar to them. So college students are better able to detect weak arguments when they're about their own school than when they're about a different school, and things like that, but don't know of anything directly on that.
Thank you.
So what has been kind of like, as you think about your research, the thing that has probably surprised you the most about your findings?
Yeah, so one thing that surprised me is just that these repetition effects happen even when you have the prior knowledge. So the first studies looking at the illusory truth effect are all the way back in the 1970s. And so for decades, there were lots of replications, but there was just this assumption that repetition only mattered when it was facts that you didn't really know if they were true or false. Like if you had prior knowledge, you would use it, and when you don't have it, then you rely on things like repetition. And instead, what we keep finding is that people often first rely on repetition, and only if that fails do they kind of consult their prior knowledge.
Yeah, I know.
I'm sorry, if anybody wants to just, okay, jump in, because I don't mean to, and Lisa, I've heard you talk and I always think of new things. It's so great. And I've just lost what I was going to say. Wait a minute. Come back to me in a second. I lost it because I was praising you. Come back. Oh, wait. I thought of it. It gets a little sideways, so it might be a different direction. But I know you've had a lot of interest from like the media, and for good reason, and for outside sources. And could you speak a little bit about who has sort of picked up your research and put it out in the world, whether for good or for not good, that they want to, because it's so topical right now, especially. I just was fascinated as to the number of people that might have jumped on what you do.
Yeah, so luckily I've had really good experiences with talking with media. People have kind of not misquoted me or used me for nefarious ends, so I've been really pleased. Some highlights were I was on the Samantha Bee show a year or two ago when they were talking about false equivalence in news stories, and how when the media is reporting on things like climate change, they'll often have one person for it and one person against it, when in fact it's like 95% of the scientists agree and only a few outliers. And so we talked about how that false equivalence can change what people remember and think about the story. So if you hear kind of a story that's 50-50, you're likely to think that the scientists are 50-50 on that same issue. And then more recently, there's been a lot of talk about kind of conspiracy theories and how they develop and the problems with them. And then also just kind of COVID misinformation more generally, because there's been so much of it.
I know you run the local news here too, right? Channel 2 or Channel 5?
Yeah, I've been on Channel 5 a couple of times talking to them about misinformation. There's a CNBC mini documentary on conspiracy theories recently that's quite good.
So I think I've had too much coffee, but here's another question. Have you ever thought about, like, is there consultant work in your future for the press, for Facebook, for, I know that's not your primary interest, but.
So I do consult with Facebook. So I've, some of my funding has come from Facebook for some of this work. And I have talked with them about kind of interventions they could do to make misinformation less of a problem. I will say that Facebook and most of the other social media companies, there are people within the company who want to do good things and have good ideas. They are very rarely listened to. So I've heard of a number of changes Facebook was thinking of making to their newsfeed or things that they were thinking of doing. Very few of them have actually come to be.
And you made me feel better and worse again, but thank you very much.
I think Nancy has a question for you, Lisa.
Yeah, hi, this is so fascinating. And what I'm wondering about that we've been talking about in our diversity class a little bit is the idea of kind of the ideas behind like Dying of Whiteness, Jonathan Metzl's book, and how do you convince people who have self-damaging beliefs? And an example he talks about in the book in Tennessee is people saying, oh, well, no, I wouldn't benefit from expanding Medicaid for the state, even though they're presented with, no, like this would provide you with life-saving healthcare. I don't want to do that because it would be the financial ruin to our state. Okay. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so tricky. I will say most of the stuff that I do, you'll notice, deals with kind of these simple facts, like the capital of the state or things like that. It gets really tricky when you're talking about beliefs, especially these kind of core beliefs that get at people's identity. Mm-hmm. Some of the only stuff I've seen to really work there is this method that people call kind of deep canvassing, where you are having kind of individual conversations with people where you're deeply listening to them, talking with them. And so there's been some work kind of around LGBT rights, where if someone comes to your door and has this discussion with you, you will often leave with a better opinion about rights for gay and lesbian couples and things like that. But kind of simple solutions don't tend to work.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'd love to know what's next. What are, like, from these studies that you've shared with us, what are the places that you hope to go to next to look into?
Yeah, so some of the work we're doing right now is looking at the effects of repetition on belief in more naturalistic settings. So rather than kind of in a laboratory, you see it once or you see it twice, spacing the repetitions out more like you would see it on actual social media. So we just did a study where we texted people different facts 5 times a day across 15 days and then gave them a final test. So on that final test, they'd seen the facts either once, twice, 4, 8, or 16 times. And what we find is this kind of beautiful logarithmic curve, where kind of each repetition increases belief, but by a diminishing amount as you keep going. So it's important for me for two reasons. One, we're showing that these repetition effects happen even in more naturalistic settings. And two, showing kind of what happens with lots of repetitions. One thing I'm really hopeful to start doing in the future is looking at repetitions, not of the exact same fact, but of kind of general concepts or ideas. So that there's often these kind of frames or messages in the media that keep getting repeated, and how does that affect belief even if it's not the same exact thing. So this idea that kind of immigrants cause crime and the effect of repeatedly seeing articles that mention that, in kind of current worries, effects of seeing misinformation about ballots and voting and things like that.
Yeah, I think that is so important. I feel like that you do hear a lot more about that at this, when election time happens. And I think, with the Muslim community, it feels like every election year you hear about the Muslim community, but then in between, there's not much. And so that, I think that'll be really fascinating to learn more about, like, how those ideas are all and how they're used politically, I think is really interesting as well. I'd love to ask you to share, where we have a couple of more minutes, any last things that you'd love to share with us, or?
I think one thing to point out is that in order to study these kind of real world problems, we need interdisciplinary research. And it's one reason that I so enjoy being at Peabody and being surrounded by people who study all sorts of different things. But you'll notice kind of some of my future research directions, like there's political science in there, there's sociology in there, there's social psychology, along with the cognitive psychology that I was kind of most formally trained in. And so I encourage kind of students to be aware not just of what happens in your little niche field, but know kind of the broader field as well, because it'll help you later on in your career dip into different things.
Thank you so much for that. And I think some people might have had to drop off a little early, but I think we have learned so much from you, Lisa. Thank you for this conversation, and for making us more aware of how we can kind of detect fake news.
Yes, and I didn't get my lesson for all of you, but the biggest thing is pause. Like before you share something on social media, pause, think about how you know this is true or false. Actually read the story before you forward the headline. Like that'll help you catch a lot of misinformation.
Thank you so much. Any other final questions or thoughts?
I have a final question.
Sure, Nana.
Lisa, can we believe what you said is true?
I'll just keep repeating it and then you'll have to believe it.
Okay, all right. That's all I needed to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great and so important.